So tempo training, well, you're probably doing tempo training. Well, you're almost certainly doing tempo training because when you're out cycling and your endurance rides, when the pace lifts a little bit, either by planning or inadvertently, you're going into that tempo zone. So the tempo zone is the zone that's above the endurance zone but below the threshold zone. So below your FTP but above your what's known as your aerobic threshold. And if you're interested in aerobic threshold, you can check out one of the videos that I've done on aerobic threshold, and you might find that useful because basically it's the fundamental thing to training for endurance events. FTP is for longer events, and the FTP is not as important as this aerobic threshold. So anyway, back to tempo. So I like to use tempo training for a couple of things. Early in the season, as part of the base period, once you've done a few weeks of endurance riding, then it's useful to introduce some tempo work. And the tempo work is, what I do is like start something like 3 by 15 minutes. So you're gradually getting used to it, and then build that up to maybe 90 minutes to a couple of hours of tempo work over the various blocks of 6 to 8 weeks. So it might take you 2 or 3 months to get up to doing 90 minutes to 2 hours of tempo work. And during that period, your fitness will have improved, so your FTP will have gone up and your training zones will have gone up. So be aware of that, and be aware of the fact that you'll actually be riding harder in your tempo training zone than you were at the start of the base period. So remember that things change, and you have to update your FTP and your training zones as your fitness develops. And that's the case whether you're a beginning rider or an experienced rider, because if you've had some downtime at the end of the season, your fitness starts to build back up as you get back into doing more cycling and building more intensity. At the start of the season, in the base period, the tempo is a good way of introducing some intensity. It can be a structured workout, so you're forming the basis of structured workouts into your training and building up that weekly routine that I talk about quite often. So where you will ultimately put interval training sessions, then you would put your tempo training sessions. And it builds up that toughness, that resilience to doing the harder work, but isn't quite as damaging as the high intensity. Obviously, you're doing quite a lot of it, more than you would do. If you compare your 4 by 5 minutes with your 90 minutes of tempo, then obviously there's a lot more volume. So you still need a lot of time to recover, but it's less intense, and your body can perhaps cope with it a little bit better during the early season. What I then tend to do is go more into a higher intensity block once I've built up the tempo work, and work on, perhaps you might be able to shift your VO2 max a little bit. You might be able to increase your FTP by providing a different stimulus. And that's a very useful way to mix the stimuli in your training, and that helps your body respond better because there's always a law of diminishing returns. If you continue to do the same training week in, week out for a very long period of time, you will improve initially. You can do maybe, you might be able to do 3 months or more of a similar type of training stimulus. But eventually it'll flatten off, so you won't get the improvements, and it's better to keep changing things about. So I might do like maybe 12 months of building the tempo and gradually increasing the high intensity work, focus a bit more on the high intensity work, and then move to a period that is more specific to what your event might be. So if you're an ultra endurance cyclist, for instance, like an ultra endurance road cyclist, then you might start to bring in more tempo work, because you might ride close to your tempo zone on long climbs or shortish climbs, and therefore being specific and getting used to that feeling is very important. But if you're riding higher intensity events like cyclocross, criteriums, short road races, or mountain bike cross-country type races, then you might want to move the intensity to be higher after that period of sort of maximal aerobic training, your 4 by 5 minutes period, because you've got to develop some anaerobic capacity. But in general, if you're doing longer endurance events, which I know a lot of you are, then I would move back to more of a tempo phase, where you might do 1 or 2 tempo sessions per week, and still include the maximal aerobic, your 4x5 minutes or your 3x8, 3 or 4x8 minutes type efforts, and that because that's more race specific. And the reason that you get more race specific with the tempo type of workouts isn't particularly because it's a good to give you the physiological gains that you need, but it can give you good psychological gains and good practice. So you get used to riding at a constantly, fairly, slightly uncomfortable level of intensity for long periods of time. Like physically, you get used to sitting still and pedaling at a nice cadence for an hour or more, particularly if you're doing a big event with very long climbs, some climbs in mountain bike marathons or ultra endurance road events, or even in Grand Fondos if you're in the Alps or a mountainous area, it could take you well over an hour to get up the climbs. So if you're climbing for a couple of hours, it might not be at tempo pace. If you're doing a multi-day event, you might still want to stay below your aerobic threshold in your training zone 2. But you are going to be feeling that way. You'll be tired, your legs are hurting, you might be finding the saddle a bit uncomfortable. And these are the sorts of feelings that you get in long tempo efforts. So for that reason, it gives you a mental preparation for that's quite specific to your events. And particularly if you don't live in a hilly area, if you do an indoor session on a trainer, or you're riding into the wind for an hour at tempo pace, that can stimulate what you need to do when you're doing these long climbs. So as you're developing the specificity for longer events, then the tempo work works quite nicely, and that's why I like to use it as you move closer to the events. If you're doing shorter events, or even if you're doing a mountain bike marathon type event, then you need to include. Mountain bike marathon's a bit of a weird one because it does have some anaerobic requirements, because you sometimes come across steep sections or technical sections. So you would want to include some anaerobic work in your specific final build-up, but also the tempo work, because there's some very long climbs where you have to sit down because you don't want your back wheel to spin, so you've got to sit in one position for a long time, which isn't entirely, it doesn't really come naturally to a lot of mountain bikers. But if you're training for the shorter events, then there's not really a strong argument for going back to the tempo work. It's probably a good idea to work on your FTP and your anaerobic capacity as you move closer to your event and become more specific. So I hope you found that useful. If you did, then please subscribe and like it, and check out my other videos, and I'm sure you'll find something useful there. Give me a comment. I really like comments. I really like to interact with you, and if you've got any questions, please ask them, and I'll either do a video on them, or I'll definitely answer all the questions that people give me. Okay, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.